Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Warren Harding, and the focus is Teapot Dome. Teapot Dome, those two words seem to be the only thing a lot of people even know about Warren Harding, and they believe that, of course, it has to do with scandal. So what was Teapot Dome? What was it all about? And was it a scandal? What was reality? What was myth? Let's unpack it in this episode. In the early days of World War I, the United States, not in the war yet, but certainly could be in the future, and so Congress decided to pass some legislation to set aside some naval preserves for oil being critical to the Navy's ability to bring its ships into a fight, and so they found some spots, including one called Teapot Dome. This was based on sort of a rock formation, a landmark in an area in Natrona County, Wyoming. That was one of these naval reserves. Another one was in Elk Hills, and another in Buena Vista, those oil fields in Kern County, California. So a few of these were set aside. But then after the war, these were still naval preserves, and the Wilson administration, still in 1920, signed into law the General Leasing Act. So what did this do? This gave the executive branch the ability to actually grant leases for commercial companies to drill on these naval reserves. Now, why would they do that? One of the reasons was there were some other commercial companies that were actually setting up shop on the borders of these naval reserves, drilling. It was believed that they were actually siphoning off some of the government oil going under that piece of the land. This was a way to recoup some of that, keep that from happening, and make some money off of these lands. It wasn't quite as urgent that they needed these for the Navy at this point. Well, this is the scene when the Harding administration comes in 1921. All of the authority for these leases potentially to grant for these naval reserves on the drilling went to the Secretary of the Navy. In this case, it was Edwin Denby. And frankly, he concluded that the Navy doesn't know how to do this. They had never really done leases for oil before, but who had? The Interior Department. And Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, made an offer to Edwin Denby. He said, look, we'll do these leases for you. It's kind of our bread and butter. We'll give you the right of refusal. If you don't like any of these deals, you can say no, but we'll do them for you. And Denby thought this was a good deal for him. Now, some in the Navy, some of the admirals thought they would be losing control, but Denby was not concerned about that. And then Fall actually sweetened the pot for the Navy a little bit even further, because normally these leases done by the Interior Department, the money coming in from those would just go into the General Treasury. Fall arranged a part of these funds would actually come in trade, good for the Navy, in oil and in tanks. Now, the Navy is concentrating even more these days on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, in the middle of the Pacific, as a key naval base, and storing oil there could be really important for them in a fight in the Pacific region. So part of Fall's arrangements with the oil companies were to build tanks and store oil from the proceeds from their drilling from these leases at Pearl Harbor. Again, Denby's thinking this is a pretty good deal. So the leases were granted primarily in these two places. The Mammoth Oil Company under Harry Sinclair, they got the deal at Teapot Dome in Wyoming. Edward Doheny and his Pan American Petroleum Company got the leases for Elk Hills. No bid contracts, which were part of the deal authorized under the General Leasing Act. Now, were there complaints about this? Sure, there were, principally from conservationists. They didn't like any drilling in these lands, so they went to Congress and started to see if they could do something to get this stopped. Where did Warren Harding stand? Well, he stepped in when Congress started asking questions, and he said, look, he supported this. I think it is only fair to say in this connection that the policy which has been adopted by the Secretary of the Interior in dealing with these matters was submitted to me prior to the adoption thereof, and the policy decided upon and the subsequent acts have at all times had my entire approval. I thought this was a decent policy as it was explained to him. And he continued to support Albert Fall. Fall had been in the Senate with him. He was one of his poker playing buddies. He was his friend. He trusted him. He told Fall, 1922 now, that he had an unaltering belief in your integrity. I had these impressions when I asked you to come into the cabinet. I have had no reason of any kind to modify my earlier impressions concerning you, either as a friend or public servant. He was a trusting soul in Warren Harding. He trusted Albert Fall. He continued to trust Fall, at least had no reason to think otherwise, when Fall resigned from the cabinet in January of 1923, even though he went to work for Harry Sinclair and his oil company on a very lucrative contract. 8 months later, Warren Harding was dead. And investigations into Teapot Dome actually at that point started to heat up in Congress after the passing of the president. Thomas Walsh in Montana, Burton Wheeler, Montana, John Kendrick, Wyoming. These were some of the congressmen who for the next 2 years, a steady drumbeat of accusations against the Harding administration and oil executives for malfeasance associated with these leases. One of the earliest witnesses, Albert Fall, he said, look, I did nothing wrong. He was in fact proud of the policies, the execution of those policies. It was good national security policy with the oil and the tanks going to Pearl Harbor. He was asked, well, sir, why no bid contracts? Well, Albert Fall responded, business purely. I knew I could get a better price without calling for bids. It was a little bit of a shaky answer, but that's what he said. Doheny and Sinclair were called to testify to Congress, and they backed Fall completely. Everything seemed to be on the up and up. Well, people kept looking into this and the investigations continue, including in the press. The Star Tribune in Fall's home state of New Mexico did some investigating into Fall's spending, and it all of a sudden in the last couple of years had gotten rather lavish. He had made major upgrades at his ranch. He paid back some back taxes, years of back taxes that he hadn't paid. All of a sudden, cleaned the books. Question was, where was the money coming from? And they found a couple of sources of money. There was $100,000 in cash that had gone to Fall about the time that Doheny got his leasing deal in California. And then they found out more than $200,000 that landed in Fall's accounts that came from Sinclair's oil company in the form of Liberty bonds. So Congress wanted to know, how did this all happen? And Harry Sinclair came and testified. He said, yes, I gave that money to Albert Fall, but it wasn't a bribe. No, sir, this was an investment. He was making an investment in Fall's ranch because he thought it could be made into a tourist attraction and therefore could become profitable. Now, there was a lot of skepticism about this, but there was really no hard evidence still to prove that anything illegal had taken place. What about that $100,000 cash payment? Who did that come from? Well, a lot of people thought it came from Doheny, but what did Fall do? He tried to deflect this. Frankly, he went shopping to find someone who would say he had given him that money. And so he went to Congress and said, the gentleman from whom I obtained it and who furnished me with cash was the Honorable Edward B. McLean of Washington, D.C. I've never approached E.L. Doheny or anyone connected with him or any of his corporations, or Mr. H.F. Sinclair or anyone connected with any of his corporations, nor have I ever received from either of said parties 1 cent on account of any oil lease or upon any account whatsoever. Now, Senator Walsh did not buy this. Who was Edward McLean? Well, he was a friend of Fall's. He was a friend of Warren Harding's. He was a wealthy man in Washington, D.C. and the owner of the Washington Post. He had even written Fall a check for $100,000 that Fall agreed not to cash to kind of show evidence that, yes, I gave him that money. Well, again, Senator Walsh didn't buy this, so he traveled to Florida where McLean was on vacation. And so look, what's going on here? And all of a sudden, Ned McLean realized he'd stuck his foot into some bit of a morass, and he came clean. He said, look, the money didn't come from me. Well, at this point, Fall is starting to fall apart. He is drinking heavily, his body's breaking down. McLean's wife, Evalyn, said that for the first time in my life, I saw a man crumble right before my eyes. Drinking had changed Fall from a virile, sharp-witted man into a trembling wreck. And in fact, he said when he was called back to testify to Congress, I'm too ill, I can't come. So Doheny was called back, and he admitted that he had given the cash to Albert Fall. It actually went from his son in a black satchel, so a little bit of a sensationalistic tale about this. But he said, look, there's nothing wrong here. This was a loan. This wasn't a bribe. It had nothing to do with business. There was nothing illegal about this. It was simply a loan that he gave to his friend. Sinclair came in to testify as well, but at this point he was getting a little bit annoyed with the whole thing, refused to answer any more questions, and he was referred to the Justice Department for contempt of Congress. This isn't where it ended. In fact, it got more sensational after this, as a couple of new characters entered the play as Senator Burton Wheeler got involved, and Burton Wheeler was really going after Harry Daugherty, the Attorney General. And there didn't really seem to be any direct links between Daugherty and what was going on in the Interior Department under Fall and Teapot Dome, but there were a lot of other accusations in general against Daugherty. He had never gotten along well with Congress, and Wheeler started to actually get some witnesses to come forward to talk about the Harding administration in general, and his key witnesses, Gaston and Roxie Stinson. Who were they? Gaston was basically a con man. He was a grifter, but he had been hired into the government by Daugherty's head of the FBI, William Burns. He became an investigator in the FBI, which sort of gave him inside access, and he came to Congress and the Wheeler Committee with all kinds of sensationalistic tales about illegal actions at the little greenhouse that we had talked about in a previous episode, all the way to the White House, implicating Daugherty and the Harding administration of all kinds of accusations of malfeasance. Did he have any proof? Well, sure, he told Congress he had all kinds of proof. He had it all. But when he was pressed and pressed, he actually never produced any to back up his sensational tales. Eventually, after investigations and court cases, Gaston Means was charged with perjury, convicted, and eventually he spent 20 months in prison. But he wasn't done. He decided to write a book. He wrote a book called The Strange Death of President Harding. Now, this was a truly inside man because he claimed he was working for the First Lady, Florence Harding. Now, Florence Harding died about a year after her husband, so she's long since passed as well. But according to Means, Florence Harding knew about Warren Harding's infidelities, his corruption. So what did she do? She essentially murdered him. She poisoned Warren Harding so that the word about all these problems would not get out. And she had done that, and that's why she ordered no autopsy to be held on Harding after he passed. Now, the book became a bestseller despite the fact that it's mostly lies. Even his co-author, the reporter May Thacker, who actually ghost wrote the book, she kept pressing him as well for where's your facts, where's your evidence, where's your documentation? And he kept saying, I've got it. And eventually she concluded he didn't, and it was all a pack of lies. In 1931, she told Liberty magazine that the whole book was a colossal hoax, a tissue of falsehood from beginning to end. Edmund Starling, he was the lead on the detail of the Secret Service for Warren Harding. He talked about Gaston Means this way as a man who would not have been caught dead telling the truth. He smeared the president and the administration with vicious and scandalous lies, which are still quoted as truth by most of the public. And that was the problem. A lot of these sensational tales has been absorbed by the public as fact. And that has persisted for years and years gone by. So, a lot of people thinking here that the Warren Harding administration completely corrupt, maybe even his wife was a murderer, all sensationalized by this testimony of Gaston Means that had been refuted but still was in the mindset of the country. Now, what about that other witness, Roxie Stinson? Well, she was the ex-wife of Jess Smith, again, who we talked about and committed suicide. We talked about in a previous episode. And she came up to the Wheeler Committee with, again, wild claims of illegal activity at that little greenhouse, corruption of bribes and kickbacks, and she came across as overly rehearsed and coached, and frankly, her claims strained credulity. She had no firsthand knowledge of any of this. All of it had supposedly come from her ex-husband, Smith, who had been long since dead. Again, highly questionable, but continued to tarnish the administration and legacy of Warren Harding. So from Congress to the courts, as Teapot Dome had legs, and it continued now to see if somebody was going to go to prison, and there were several trials held associated with Teapot Dome. Conspiracy to commit bribery was the principal charge, first against Fall and Doheny in a trial in 1926. Both were found not guilty. The next year, Fall and Sinclair were charged similar crimes. 1927 came back to juries, not guilty. Around the same time, the Supreme Court got in the middle of this, and they actually invalidated the leases at Teapot Dome and in Elk Hills, citing collusion and conspiracy. So that was a decision about the leases. But in terms of people going to prison for any of this, so far nobody's been convicted. More evidence came forward, more trials, and finally somebody got convicted, and that was Albert Fall. In October of 1929, a jury came back. Fall, he's a broken man, he's in a wheelchair, but he was found guilty of accepting a bribe. But even this came with a twist, because in the same court, in front of the same judge where Fall was convicted, Doheny was on trial, and a jury came back and found him innocent. He was not guilty of giving the bribe that Fall had been convicted of accepting. So even that had an odd twist to it. Fall did get a year in prison, $100,000 fine. He served it, he paid it. But part of that, just to add insult to injury, Doheny, to cover his tracks, to say, remember that loan I gave you, Mr. Fall? I want my $100,000 back. Fall couldn't pay, and he foreclosed on his ranch. So back to the Wheeler Committee now for just a moment, because as Teapot Dome piece came to an end, again, investigations continued all around the same time with Harry Daugherty once again in the crosshairs. Initially, Harry Daugherty stayed on as the Attorney General for Calvin Coolidge, even though many were calling for him to be fired. Again, the rumors of malfeasance were widespread, and Senator William Borah actually came to the president and told Calvin Coolidge, well, you got to get rid of this guy. And Coolidge initially resisted. He said Daugherty was Harding's friend. He stands high with the Republican organization. I do not see how I could do it. But things intensified, and when Daugherty refused to testify, refused to hand over documents to Wheeler's committee, eventually in March of 1924, Coolidge did ask Daugherty to resign. Again, the courts now taking over also in the case of Daugherty, not associated directly with Teapot Dome. He was never charged with a crime there, but there was a case related to a company called the American Metal Company. This was not a charge of bribery against Daugherty, but there were charges of malfeasance on Daugherty's behalf, actually negligence and failure to prosecute some alleged fraudulent transactions associated with returning alien property back to the Germans after the war. That was a complicated scenario that Jess Smith was involved in. Smith had been charged posthumously, essentially, with taking a bribe and pushing this case through the Justice Department, of course, all of which Daugherty was responsible for, and Daugherty was charged with negligence in the performance of his duty. He went on trial not once but twice. First trial came back with a hung jury, no decision. Government tried him again, came back again, hung jury, no decision, even though the vote was 11-1 in favor of conviction. That one juror kept Harry Daugherty from going to jail. He could honestly say, look, I've never been convicted of anything. Very few people seem to get as close to being convicted of crimes throughout his career as Harry Daugherty, but he never was. One juror away, but again, not, and then the case was dropped after that. But all of this continued to be a stain on the Harding administration. So what was this all about? Was there corruption in the Harding administration? Yes, there was. We talked about in previous episodes, Charles Forbes at the Veterans Bureau. We talked about Jess Smith and his suicide on the eve of being arrested for some crime, we don't know exactly what it was, and Albert Fall, the first cabinet member in American history to go to prison for anything, and that was associated with Teapot Dome. None of this directly touched Warren Harding. Warren Harding told Smith that he was going to be arrested. He fired Charles Forbes when he found out that he was committing crimes and taking kickbacks at the Veterans Bureau. And nobody knew that Albert Fall had taken a bribe until well after Warren Harding had been dead. He supported Fall's policy because on the surface it seemed like a reasonable policy. He had no reason to expect corruption at the time. So Harding didn't really have anything to do with any of these. Compare this, for example, to the Ulysses Grant administration, where 4 cabinet secretaries resigned during his 2 terms. Why? Bribery and kickbacks. One of them actually went on to be impeached. Other friends of Grant that he had put into lower levels of office were found guilty of crimes, tax evasion, and problems with the whiskey rings. They had gone to prison, so personal friends of his. Now, that was an administration all the way up through in the cabinet that was pretty corrupt. Warren Harding's administration didn't come close to this, but that's not really the reputation that has carried forward. So why this terrible reputation of scandal covering over Warren Harding's administration? Well, we can only speculate. First of all of this dragged out for years. It was in the constant press for year after year after year, Teapot Dome after Teapot Dome. It was sensational testimony. It didn't matter that a lot of it turned out to be lies from a Gaston Means or a Roxie Stinson or others. The sensational testimony, the books that were written, a lot of that stuck in the minds of the American people. Warren Harding wasn't around to defend himself. He never was asked about this, never put on the stand, never called to Congress, never given a chance to even confront any of his accusers. So there was really no defense. And if people like Harry Daugherty were his defense, they were not very credible. So those were other reasons that contributed to sort of this full reputational damage that had gone on in the Harding administration. Some of this had an immediate effect actually on Harding in terms of where he was trying to rest in peace. He had originally been buried in the Marion Cemetery, but the Warren Harding Association that was stood up raised about $700,000 to build a grand tomb as a memorial to Harding where he and Florence would rest for eternity. Well, it took years before this would be dedicated, because while all these investigations and all these trials were going on, President Coolidge really just didn't want to get involved with a commemoration for Harding while his reputation was being tarnished so much in Washington, D.C. So nothing happened in his term. Herbert Hoover, the former Commerce Secretary under Harding, he becomes president in 1929, and even he initially balked at doing anything. But in 1931, he finally agreed, let's go ahead and dedicate this tomb for Warren Harding and Marion, Ohio. And he came and he gave a speech. He praised Harding, but he also gave an honest reflection about the administration. These acts never touched Warren Harding, Hoover said. He was a man of delicate sense of honor, of sympathetic heart, of transcendent gentleness of soul, who reached out for friendship, who gave of it loyally and generously, a man of passionate patriotism. But any objective weighting of Mr. Harding's presidential contribution in the balance of time must show that his playmates tipped the scales from his very considerable accomplishments in national progress toward national degeneration. His playmates. Warren Harding was a trusting soul, and clearly too trusting a soul, and it really cost him in the damages here for his reputation. So Teapot Dome, what was it? Was it a scandal? Yes. One man in the government, Albert Fall, the Secretary of the Interior, convicted of taking a bribe, which he pretty clearly did, and he went to prison for it. That was Teapot Dome. A lot of other noise around Warren Harding's administration, other terms and things like that, but in terms of placing it on Harding himself, history has really overdone it, perhaps, in weighing down his administration with this bumper sticker, if you will, of Teapot Dome. But the truth is, there were other scandals also associated with the Harding administration, and that had to do with his personal life and his mistresses. That is the story for another day. That is Warren Harding and Teapot Dome, from the life of Warren Harding. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles.